Hello and welcome to episode 63 of the world's first Paul Weller fan podcast. I'm Dan Jennings, and 10 years ago I gave up my live streaming career as a radio presenter with one big regret: never getting to interview my hero, the legendary British musician Paul Weller. This podcast exists purely to solve that issue. Welcome to Desperately Seeking Paul. And in this episode, I'm joined by broadcaster and journalist John Wilson. Now, you're going to love this. Honestly, it was amazing to hear so many passionate stories of his love of the jam. It's a proper outpouring of emotions, of memories, and proper envy-inducing tales from a guy who's a master storyteller as far as I'm concerned. One of the regular presenters of Front Row. He's interviewed everybody from Ray Davies to Bowie to McCartney, Elton John, Kate Bush, and interviewed Paul Weller on many occasions on that Radio 4 show too. In 2007, he worked with Paul to create the book Suburban 100, and Mr. Weller guested on his Radio 4 music programme Mastertapes. In fact, Paul's also been a guest more recently on John's These Three Songs podcast, and John returned the favour by interviewing him for the Making of True Meanings documentary. We're going to dig into all this stuff on the podcast. You're in for a real treat. My guest this week, John Wilson. Thanks for joining me.
Pleasure, Dan. It's good to be here.
I love talking about Paul Weller with people who have met Paul Weller, who have interviewed Paul Weller, because we'll get into this with the podcast, because this is the ultimate aim of the podcast, is to be able to meet Paul, have a conversation, do the interview that I never managed. So all the way through here, I'm going to be picking up tips from you. You realise that?
Right. Yeah. I could just call him now. Do you want, just kind of,
no.
Oh, no, it ruins the whole point of the podcast, doesn't it?
Is he on your phone? What's he in there as?
Probably some secret code. I don't know. PW, I think.
PW. Oh, nice. Cool. We have to kick off understanding when it was that you first fell in love with the music of Paul Weller. And I know for a fact it was the jam. And am I right in thinking it's your Aunt Liz that we have to thank for this?
Oh, wow. You've done your research, haven't you? She'll be really impressed by that. Yeah, my Aunt Liz, my mum's sister, who was quite a bit younger than my mum, but only a few years older than me. So I was at school. Liz went to university. And I remember she just had great taste. But I think when well, actually, do you know what? Growing up, I remember on her bedroom wall, it was all Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, and I remember there was a picture of Roy Harper, because we used to go and stay. She lived in Derbyshire, in a small village in Derbyshire, and she had these sort of really exotic posters of bands I'd never heard of, meant nothing to me. So obviously that was her taste growing up. And then she went to university and everything changed, I guess. So she would have gone, late 70s, 78, something like that. And at the same time, I guess I was discovering or hearing change on the radio, and there were things that were sort of catching my ear. I remember hearing, I think Strangetown was the first thing that really got me, maybe Tube Station, I can't remember. But at around the same sort of time, Liz gave me a cassette of two cassettes, C90s. It had In the City, This Is the Modern World, and I'm not sure she had All Mod. Yeah, I think she had All Mod Cons and the first Clash album. That's right. So there was so it was the Clash and the Jam. And I was already sort of really digging Blondie in particular. And so things were changing. But yeah, Liz kind of led me to the jam properly. Yeah. It just made sense. It just made sense totally. There was something very exotic and otherworldly about Blondie, and I was obviously totally in love with Debbie Harry. I mean, it was weird, actually. The other day, ABBA announced they were reforming as Avatars or Avatars or whatever they want to call it. And it made me think about how, and I did a couple of things on the radio talking about my thoughts on ABBA, because I did love ABBA as a kid, absolutely loved them. And it just made me think, yeah, I saw ABBA. They were the first band I saw. And I was thinking back to when that was, and I realized I worked out it was Wembley. There was a series of shows. They did about a week of shows, I think, or a couple of weeks of shows at Wembley in 79. And I looked up the date and it was November 79. And I realized it was the end of 79. So 2 weeks later, I saw the Jam for the first time. So that was a kind of a real pivotal moment. It was the sort of letting go of my childhood in a way, the music that I'd kind of the pop, and it was moving into something different. And I remember going to see ABBA with it was like a family outing. They'd got tickets. My mum and dad had got tickets. I think the whole family went. It was amazing. And I was by that time, I was already into the Jam and the Clash. And I remember being a stroppy, I don't know, what was I, 13 or something, but I had a Jam badge and a Clash badge on, a red V-neck jumper, which I wore to this ABBA gig, thinking, I'm far too cool for this. And of course, I did love ABBA still. I mean, it was just amazing. It was an amazing gig. But then it would have been 2 weeks later. I mean, I've never thought about it like that, actually, until I was talking about ABBA on the radio the other week about how close that was. And I'd never really associated the two gigs. They were two very different times in my life in a way. But then I realized they were 2 weeks apart, because it was the Rainbow shows I saw of the Jam, as any Jam fan knows, on that Setting Sun's tour. It was recorded for Radio 1's In Concert. So I remember it was I would say 3rd or 4th of December. I remember it was the first few days of December, 4th of December, I'd say, 1979. And I'd never heard anything like it. I remember just being up in the gods, and they came on and went into Girl on the Phone. And I was just, what the hell is that noise? I mean, it sounded nothing like the record. You know, it didn't have those lovely sort of chiming guitars and the harmonies. It was just this wall of noise. I'd never heard anything like it. And it was for an hour and a half. It was utter mayhem and joyous. And then, you know, that was it. I didn't look back. And there were a few gigs at the Rainbow like that I saw that, you know, still to this day, I think are some of the greatest things I've ever seen, you know.
Polar opposites from that 2 weeks before at ABBA.
Yeah, I can't remember too much about it. You know, I remember we had tickets at the side of the stage. I remember looking across at ABBA, and I remember it was very slick and probably sounded exactly like the record. And I think that's probably part of why it was a shock when I saw the Jam. I sort of expected them to sound, because the thing is, at the time, I'd never seen the Jam live on television even. You know, maybe by that time I'd have seen the video for, you know, Strange Town and When You're Young, definitely. So actually I had seen them, of course, you know what, because they'd been on something else, hadn't they? They'd been on that program, Something Else, when they debuted Eton Rifles. They play When You're Young and Eton Rifles. And it was pretty raw sounding, but it was totally different when you heard them in a theatre, you know, in a room, in a hall. It was just and it's just the noise and the crowd and it was just absolutely enormous. I mean, seriously, life-changing moment.
And I love the fact that from that point on, like you say, you're hooked and you're into it. And we'll talk about the love of the music and the love of the lyrics, but tell me more about the live experience. So you saw them quite a few times live from that point on, yeah?
Yeah. Every tour, I guess, that was 79, 80. I remember, I think that my favorite gig, I think, was the one they did, I would say probably April 1980. And I think it was an anniversary of the Rainbow Theatre. I think it was because it had been the Finsbury Park Astoria. It started as a cinema. And then, of course, it was the Finsbury Park Astoria. The Beatles famously used to play their Christmas shows there. Amazing. Do you know what I've got? Look. I've got this. I just suddenly realised this is sitting next to me and should describe to your listeners. So it's an artwork by, I can't remember the name of the guy. I think he's called Stuart Free. I'm trying to look at the initials there. And that's a painting of the old Rainbow Theatre, which is not far from where I live now. But that place I used to love, it's now been turned into a church. I think it's some Brazilian kind of Pentecostal church owned it. It's so sad. It's really sad. But anyway, I remember going to the Rainbow in April 1980. I think it was like the 25th anniversary of the Rainbow, of it being the Rainbow or something like that, or maybe 10th, I don't know. And they were number one at the time with Going Underground. It was just huge. And I was down in the stalls, so it was different. And there was something, it was very tribal, obviously, at the time. It was, you know, the mod thing had really kicked in. I remember actually the first time I went in December 1979, there was an Arsenal game on the same night. So Arsenal Stadium just around Highbury was just around the corner from the Rainbow. And my mum and dad were at the Arsenal game and they were going to hang around afterwards and pick me and my friend Ian Mullins up from the gig. Oh my God, there was this almighty ruck afterwards. There was this huge ruck, all these sort of Arsenal, because there was a big sort of skinhead thing at Arsenal then in the late 70s, and all these Arsenal skinheads. And I'm a big Arsenal fan, you know, so I was kind of caught in this, came out to the Rainbow.
Which side am I going to pick?
All these by that time I was sort of, you know, I knew my tribe by that time. It was the Jam, you know, and, but there was this huge ruck and all these Arsenal skinheads when the bottles were flying, and we remember running underneath the bridge and hiding in this doorway and this sort of riot breaking out. And it was quite exciting. I think about it now, it was really dangerous, but I'm running round the corner into Plimsoll Road where my mum and dad were waiting. And it was sort of, they were sort of absolutely furious. It was like, well, you know, look at all this violence. And I was like, no, those are the football fans. Those, you know, nothing to do with the, you know, the sort of beautifully dressed mods who were falling out of the Rainbow and into this hail of bottles and fists. But anyway, so, that wasn't really what it was about. It was about the music for me. It was just the music. It was the music. I suppose there was a kind of sense of belonging. And I think probably more than anything, right from the start, it was the lyrics. But I was hooked. I did see them then in 1980. I probably saw them later in 1980 on Setting Sun's tour, 2 nights running. You know, we used to go. I know the friends of mine that would follow them around, sort of bunk off from school. And, you know, where were you last night? We're up in Manchester. You know, what? You know, then we went across to Bridlington and then we went, you know, but I would try and, I've still got ticket stubs somewhere, and it is amazing when you look and they was like £2.
Yeah.
You know, but actually it was probably a lot of money. You know, I had to save up some pocket money to go. But I would do that, go and see them 2 nights running, and then actually saw them two nights running at the Michael Sobel Sports Centre, which was at the end of 1981, I think, when they were previewing The Gift. And The Gift hadn't come out then. And something had changed. I remember it was just amazing. I mean, that was just incredible gigs as well. The sound had changed and there was a real soul thing. And I remember they did Give Me Just a Little More Time, Chairman of the Board song. And they did, I can't remember, some soul covers. You know, Ghosts was previewed that night. And it was like, wow, what's that? You know, and they came on all night, there were 4 gigs in that series and they were CND benefit gigs. I saw them 2 nights at the Sobel Centre and friends of mine saw them at the Hammersmith Palais, and they came on every night with The Gift. And it was just, you know, that bang. It's quite hard to describe it really because it's such a visceral thing. Yeah. You know, it was so visceral and it's sort of bound up in my sort of distant memory, but it's lodged very firmly there.
You mentioned the love of lyrics and falling in love with the music in these songs as well as the live experience. And there was something very special about the 3 of them together. And you also mentioned like the evolution of that band from where they came to what you were hearing then, you know, years later. But a really quick evolution. We're only talking about a lifespan of the band for like 5 years, aren't we? That's
amazing, isn't it? When you think now, you know, people say, I don't know, there's another, Coldplay are releasing another album, you know, first one in 5 years or something. You know, Jam used to release an album every year. You know, and then singles that weren't even on the albums. And a lot of bands did that. But I think you heard the evolution. And I think with Paul, a lot of it goes back to the Beatles, obviously. And you think about the evolution of the Beatles and those leaps, those seismic artistic leaps every time, you know, that you go from, you know, Rubber Soul and into Revolver, into, you know, Sgt. Pepper's. And every time there's a different sound, there's a different approach, there's a thematic change, you know, the look of the band changes. And I think that was a really big thing with Paul. And I think that's what's made him just so relevant to this day, you know, because he has never really, you know, I think he's embraced his past a lot more in recent years and come to terms with it. But there has been that sort of constant quest to do something new every time. And you saw that within the Jam. It is amazing, you know, that leap from, well, first of all, from This Is the Modern World to All Mod Cons. But I heard all those records all at the same time. So I sort of really began with Setting Sun, well, sort of, you know, hearing Strangetown and into When You're Young. But Setting Suns was, it was just totally different to anything I'd heard at that time. You know, the complexity of it. I've talked to Paul about this really. And lyrically, it's so dense. The character studies, you know, he started off with this idea of a concept album. It didn't really fulfill that aim, but there was a sort of loose idea of a journey of, you know, letting go of your past. And he framed it within this notional, civil war and these 3 mates who were thrown together and then went their separate ways. And I think at the heart, there was the sense of him being very different to a lot of his mates and making a leap from where he came to where he was heading to. And he knew he was having to change all the time and let go of the past. And I think you hear that. But I think in Thick as Thieves in particular, I think, you know, the density, the complexity and the poetry of that lyric in particular is still astonishing to me. You know, and you think that he was at the time, he would have been 20, 21 maybe, but I think probably 21 when it came out, but when he was, you know, 20, 21 when he wrote it. And I remember years ago making a program for Radio 4 about English pop lyricists and sort of drawing a line from Ray Davies through Paul, Damon Albarn, Alex Turner. You know, there was a sort of the idea really of that kind of the sort of quintessential, you know, it's sort of often called the quintessential English lyric. And very much it's about suburbia. You know, it's about character studies, vignettes, small town dramas, all of those sort of things which speak to a bigger truth about the world. And I remember talking to Simon Armitage, who's now, of course, the poet laureate, and phoning Simon up and just saying, look, would you talk about this? And he was saying, yeah, no, he said, I get that totally. And I started saying, look, and I remember quoting Thick as Thieves, you know, and I said, I still think about, you know, we stole the burning sun and the open sky, the twinkling sun. And he just carried that on the line. twinkling stars in the black night, we stole the greenbelt fields that made us believe, we stole everything that we can see. Something came along and changed our minds. I don't know what, and I don't know why, but oh Christ, now I've forgotten it. But it's that thing, it's hardwired in, and it was hardwired into him as well. And we both went, oh my God, wow. How where does that come from? Where does that spring from in a kid who's 20 years old, who, by his own admission, wasn't academic at school, enjoyed English, but, not a lot else. Obviously didn't grow up at home with a library and a tutor. So he just had a way with words. And it's astonishing, it's really astonishing. And there's so many lyrics from that album. And that was really the sort of gateway, Setting Sun's the gateway for me. And I think there's so many lyrics on that album. Private Hell is just amazing. And
oh, yeah. I was talking to Hannah Peel about Private Hell because obviously they reversioned it with the orchestra for the recent concerts. And that song the lyrics on that song, it's so bleak, isn't it? But it sounds so great. It's such a great song.
It's funny, isn't it? Because I talked to Paul about that for a different program. I can't remember which program we were talking about, but he said about resetting it for that True Meanings live show at the Royal Festival Hall with Hannah leading the orchestra. He felt quite uncomfortable about that lyric because it is so bleak and it's got such a cynical, but it's just amazing couplets in it, and again, it's the attention to detail and it's how he knew, where did that come from? That woman with the sadness and the sort of, floating down the high street in the Valium haze. And, the kids aren't writing letters to, because they've gone off and they don't need her anymore. And she's lonely and the, husband just doesn't care. And projecting himself into a world that was so different to the life he was living. And that's, that is astonishing. And yet I was quite surprised in a way that Paul said he felt very uncomfortable singing it because he wouldn't.
Yeah, he said he wouldn't be that harsh now, wouldn't it? I remember hearing that. That was on the podcast, these three songs. And
it was on that. It was on these three.
Yeah, he said he felt kind of uncomfortable listening because it was so harsh. It was so kind of...
That's right. Yeah. But it is amazing. And I just think, we did at school, I just remember taking in, I think it was Wasteland, I think in an English class, we were asked to bring in a poem and I brought in Wasteland. And then I was told by the teacher that didn't count because you were just cheating. That's not a poem. And I just said, no, it is a poem. And I think a lot of his songs were written as poems. I'm not sure if that one was. I suspect it was because there was a bit more of a free form structure to it. Just beautiful imagery. I just think that idea, again, very, very bleak lyric, when and if, oh God. The sort of images of songs that kind of are there in my imagination the whole time. That's the weird thing about a lot of those lyrics, that they lodge their way in and I sometimes sort of see them rather than remember them as lines.
Yeah.
They were like film. They were like little films. That's the interesting thing now, thinking about it. You've really got me thinking about this, Dan. I haven't, honestly, it's, God, that's really interesting. And of course, a lot of it is to do with the fact that you didn't have the visualization. Now, of course, even on Spotify, sometimes you listen on Spotify, you get a little kind of imagery moving, or you get the lyrics and, every song that's released has got a film going with it and everything has to be visualized. But of course, then, apart from the singles, which in the late 70s, of course, videos were just getting up and running. But I think most of the songs that I loved, which probably were the album tracks, you had to create your own films in your head, and there's film, certainly sort of images, scenes that I would probably, I could easily direct in my head based on the lyrics of those songs, particularly on the Setting Sun's album,
Well, it was songs like Tube Station and stuff like that.
Tube Station was like, he wrote that as I think he said to me I've got a copy of it here, as you can see. I dug it off the shelf. I had the huge privilege and pleasure of editing this anthology of lyrics, Suburban 100. Have you got this? Have you got a copy of this?
I have. It's a beautiful book.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. It is a lovely thing. This is the original run of them.
And that was 2007, I think I'm right in saying. So it takes us past Heliocentric and Illumination and pre-22 Dreams.
We did update it, actually.
How did that project come about? How did you get involved in that?
Paul asked me. We had done, I think he knew I was a fan and I'd done some interviews with him. I'd done a big interview with him years before for a Radio 4 program, which was just a one-on-one interview when Stanley Road came out. It was just before Stanley Road. And I persuaded him to come into the studio, and he played some songs acoustically. You know, I was in the studio when he played You Do Something to Me for the first time, you know, wow. And he said, this is a new song.
Wow.
This is a new song. I've just written this. Oh yeah, go on then, play that. And I remember just going, my God, my God, that's, so that was kind of years before. And then I'd done interviews, you know, several interviews with him. I don't know. I guess I'd sort of got to know him and used to see him at shows and, you know, not very well. But he then heard, I think it was actually off the back of that program I was just telling you about, that English pop lyric program, which was an edition of Front Row on Radio 4. So it had Paul was in it, Damon was in it, Ray Davies was in it, and Simon Armitage and a couple of other people as well. And I sent Paul a copy, and I think he got the idea of, you know, that I was sort of looking at him in a sort of literary way. And we were talking very much about the sort of literary nature of the lyrics. And he phoned me up and he just said, look, I've been asked to do a book by Random House Publishing Company, and they have said I can do anything. And, or, you know, they wanted him to write a memoir, or they wanted to write something or whatever, you know. And he said, no, I'll do a book of poems, of lyrics, you know, but I want it like a poetry book, like an anthology, no pictures, nothing else, but I need help putting it together. And will you edit it? I went, well, I'll have a think about it. So it was, yeah, I mean, it was a huge privilege. It was, so we picked, 100. I mean, it was like, I think that's why we called it Suburban 100. Look at that. I didn't even realize that was in there. I've just opened the front thing and there's a little note from Paul.
Oh, brilliant.
Saying, look, possible titles. He'd obviously sent this to me.
Read it out for me, sir.
For the sake of your listeners, I'm holding up to the camera so Dan can see. Look, it says post titles. Suburban 100, the Great Suburban 100, the Suburban 100. Does it matter if 100 is the exact number? So we thought, I don't know, he just liked the idea of suburbia and 100 songs. So we decided we'd set, you know, that was the parameter. It was like, let's pick 100. And we were both agreed. And I just said, look, it's not about the greatest hits and it's not about necessarily all the ones that people know. Let's go for songs that read on the page, that stand up as poetry. Or not even as poetry, but as lyrics that you can read and enjoy on the page. Mm-hmm. We spent several evenings around his kitchen table I printed out all the lyrics, you know, the hundreds. There are, you know, at the time, there was, I don't know, I think we had about 300 or 400 lyrics, and sort of going through and just writing notes for them. So I would talk to him and he would sort of dictate to me. He would say his thoughts about them and I would write down what he was saying, and then I would sort of suggest maybe something. And so and each of the lyrics on the book comes with a little annotation, but just short notes. You know, some of them are longer than others, but, you know, most of them are just sort of short observations or memories about where he was when he wrote them or what they're about. And Paul was still drinking then. So my memory of those sessions in 2007 was that I would arrive around with a couple of bottles of red wine, and then, you know, 3 hours later we'd have a few lyrics done. So no, that was quite a...
Wow, what an experience. Yeah.
Yeah, it was lovely. And I think it's a beautiful book. I think it's a really beautiful book. And the cover was designed by Peter Blake. So it's a sort of an image of Paul, but faceless. The facial features are not there. They're sort of, you know, in a very blank sort of way. I don't know. I'm not really sure why that is, but the image behind is of the cooperative store. It's an old image of a co-op from the 60s that Peter Blake happened to get because he thought it worked. But of course, there's a reference to the co-op in a town called Malice, and Paul liked that. You know, I think Peter had suggested a few different covers, and this was one, and it was like, well, that chimes. You know, there's a little subliminal reference to a lyric there. And as a designer, we worked with a designer called Suzanne Dean, who is the best book designer in the business. And she has, I mean, famously, she did Sense of an Ending, the Julian Barnes novel, which won the Booker Prize. And Julian Barnes got up that night at the Guildhall when he won the Booker and dedicated his win to Suzanne Dean, the best book designer in the business. And, you know, he had that right because she designed this for us. And it's just it's a lovely thing. It was a very limited run, the hardback. I know it's available in paperback, but yeah.
And how did Paul feel looking back? Because you mentioned earlier on, he doesn't tend to do that too much. He's not somebody who reminisces an awful lot, from what I can understand anyway. He's not a sentimental person in that way. Was it a good experience looking back at those old lyrics, or was he critiquing himself?
Obviously, yeah. And I think he was very definite that he didn't want any. We didn't have anything. I think the earliest lyric is Tube Station, and I was arguing for there were a couple from. I mean, we could have had In the City, and actually thinking back, it shows the full development. And actually, if I'd done it with him again now, and if I was a bit bolder as an editor, I would have said, no, you've got to have In the City there, because that's you at 17 years old projecting yourself, and it's the aspiration and all of that idea. And actually, some of those lyrics on the first album, they may have been a bit crude and naive. They tell a story as well. And there's that line, I know I come from Woking and you'll say I'm a fraud, but my heart is in the city where it belongs. He didn't want it. And he just thought the lyrics, and Paul was very definite about the lyrics that worked on the page that you could read and that would sort of stand up and would have a sort of strength that would look good and that you could enjoy as works to be read, that you didn't necessarily have to have the association with the music or the time or, that punk thing or where he was at the time. Do they just stand up on the page? And I think we started with Tube Station. No, he wasn't reluctant to look back in that way. I think he fully embraced, and I think in a way it may have prompted him to reassess some of those lyrics. He certainly put Thick as Thieves back into the live set because I argued so strongly about that lyric. And I just said, look, that is above and beyond the usual standard for a pop lyric.
Yeah.
The complexity and the narrative and the whole scenario being played out. It's such a beautiful lyric. And, he stuck it back in the live set, which was
nice. Good result. Well, thank you for that, John. Thank you. We owe you one for that, I have to say. I'm going to take you back to 1982. How did you feel when the band split, and what were your feelings? Initially, you loved the Style Council, from my understanding, and Cafe Blur. But I mean, you talk about evolution. My God, that album couldn't sound any further removed from the Jammers material, could it? But how did you feel when they called it a day, or when Paul called it a day? I
remember it vividly. I remember my mum coming in, because again, there was no whisper on. If you were probably plugged in to, I don't know, the inner circle, or you were one of the really hardcore fans. I mean, I consider myself a hardcore fan, but actually I've met people in the years since that were, would follow them, that would be in those sound checks. I was probably too young for that. But I remember my mum coming in with a paper, I think it was the Daily Mirror, and it just said Jam split. And it was like, what? And then I used to get the NME as well. And of course, it was in the NME, I think the same day. So I think they'd probably seen the NME early edition and then, turn around the front page. And I think it was on the front page or the inside page of the Mirror. And it was, I was really shocked. I was shocked. And I can't remember what I felt, probably resigned to it. But what I do remember very vividly are the final gigs at Wembley. I wasn't at the final gig at Brighton Centre, but I saw them for 3 nights running at Wembley Arena.
With a tear in your eye?
Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah. But actually, they were quite joyous, those gigs, if I remember. They sounded different. I remember the first night that I saw them, they came on early. They would always come on at 9 o'clock, the Jam. It was a sort of, 9 o'clock, the bang, they would be on. And I remember being caught out, and we were in the bar, or was sort of in Wembley Arena, great big cavernous place, and suddenly hearing this very echoey, big booming sound of Start. And they came on and played Start, and it was like, what? They're on, and it was sort of 8:30. And obviously they were going to do a long show, and it was like a 2-hour show or something. But I remember at the time thinking they sound different. They sounded different. Partly, this is a very muso observation. You can see on my Zoom screen down in the background. Yeah. I've got a bass guitar there. So I started playing bass when I was a kid, and there was something wrong as soon as I walked in. I realized that Bruce wasn't playing a Fender Precision. He was playing this thing, which I later realized was an Aria Pro or something, which has got a sort of it hasn't got that depth. It hasn't got that grunt and that distinctive thing, which drove so much of the Jam. And it was a more, in a weird way, more of a refined sound. And that's clearly what they were trying to get. And it was sparser, and they had the horns and they had the backing singers, and it was moving, now in retrospect, you can see it was moving towards where he then headed to. It was the musical stepping stone. But I just thought those shows were really joyous. I just thought they were amazed. They were like celebrations of everything, so that they would go from doing, quite complex versions of In the Crowd, to, really punky version of In the City. But they were fast and lean, and it felt great. It felt really good. And I saw them 3 nights running. And the final night I don't know if you know, my dad used to play football.
Yes, I do. Bit of a goalie, to say the least. But
my dad was a goalkeeper.
Bloody brilliant goalkeeper, though, right?
And so he was a television presenter, and he was presenting Grandstand and Football Focus and stuff. But he had, the week before, he had played five-a-side football in a tournament. He was still playing and doing all sorts of things like that, but he was playing in a five-a-side tournament at Wembley Arena, and he had an all-access pass. And I took this pass with me on the final night of the Wembley show. There were 5 shows at Wembley, and I saw 3 of them. I saw two nights running, and then I saw the last night. And the last night, I went with this pass, and I'd scratched out, because there was a sort of the date, and I'd scratched it out with a pin and written in the date over the top. And I thought this is never going to work. And I didn't want to risk it, and then getting thrown out. So I waited until the encores, and I was there with a couple of friends, and I went down, and I had no idea how to get backstage. And I remember going down the sort of side of the arena and then down, and I asked some commissioner. And then Wembley Arena had these commissionaires that would have uniforms, and they'd have epaulets and shiny brass buttons and kind of peak caps. And they were all like, they looked like sort of Chelsea pensioners standing there at the door. And I was say, like, excuse me, I need to get backstage. Oh yes, flash this pass. Oh yeah, down there. And I was okay. So I went through this door. God. I go through this door, go through these, and I said to somebody else, I need the backstage. Through that door there. And I opened this door, and I was standing by the side of the stage, and I went, oh my God. And there was this, huge, hairy minder guy standing by the stage with a torch, who I years later realized was Kenny. We used to see, the roadies, the Jam roadies. Jam roadies never looked like anything like Jam fans or the Jam themselves. They're like from a different era, huge and hairy. And, I think it was Big Kenny was standing there. And I flashed this pass. And I remember him looking at me very quizzically, like, that's not right. That's not one of our passes. But he knew I was chancing it, and he just went, whatever, just stand there. And then they came running past, and they didn't come running past. They came out and they stood next to me. And I was so, I just thought this is just the maddest thing ever. They were standing there waiting for the kind of signal to go back on, because the lights were going to dim. They were going to go back on and do the first encore. And they piled, and they were standing there next to me. And I just patted them all on the back. Like I was just like, good luck, boys, go. And I sort of just thought, what are you doing? You shouldn't be here. And they went back on and did, I think they did In the City, and finished off with, I think, The Gift.
That's brilliant.
And I stood there. And I tell you the other thing I remember, Big Country. Remember Big Country supported them. Stuart Adamson, who was the guitarist in the Skids, had formed Big Country. And he had really, he died later, really sadly. And Big Country was supporting them. And he was standing by the stage with me watching. And I got talking to him. I thought, if I talk to Stuart Adamson, then they're not going to throw me out. I'm sort of clinging on to him and trying to make conversation with him. And then we went up the steps, because we were down sort of by the side of the stage. And we went up and we stood on the side of the stage. And so I watched the last 3 songs I ever saw by the Jam. I was standing on the stage. And it's, it's like a dream now. It's almost like it didn't happen. I sometimes wonder if it did happen, but no, I know it did happen, and it was an amazing, amazing thing.
Brilliant. That is brilliant.
Yeah. And I just also aware, actually, looking out, because I could see out. I'd never had that perspective on a gig before, looking out. I'd always looked into the stage, and I was looking out, and I suddenly saw the enormity of it and how huge and what a massive wall of people and the noise. But I was aware of people my age and older, mostly boys, young men, crying when the lights came up, and I stood there looking out. I remember seeing people wiping tears away and just thinking, wow, this is huge, So yeah, it was big, wasn't it? It was.
That's a brilliant story. I'm guessing Paul doesn't know that.
I don't know, actually. I think
maybe over one of those glasses of red wine.
I think so. Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
And I saw something on Twitter about when you first met. It was Paul Weller's birthday, his 25th, May 1983.
Yeah. And we went to the Paris Theatre. It was the first Style Council show. I think they may have done something. Did they do something in Brockwell Park, a C&D thing? I can't remember which the official first gig was, but it was their sort of first broadcast, and it was a Radio 1 in concert, and it was in the Paris Theatre, and we got tickets, and I don't know how we managed to blag backstage. Again, I had a dodgy pass. It was a different pass, and I was there with a couple of people. I was with my sister, my friend Richard Hawes, and his girlfriend Minnie, and we went back, and we got introduced to Paul, and we stood there chatting for about 20 minutes, and it was his 25th birthday. When I think about that now, my God, my son is older than my son's 26. And I just think he had just split up the biggest band in Britain, and I had his poster all around my wall. And he was only 20. He was 24, 24 when he split up the Jam, 25 that day when I first met him. Brilliant. Astonishing.
And it's a lovely tweet because you talk about the fact there's no excuse for my hair or jumper, I think is the phrase.
I had big hair, didn't I? It was like, do you know what it was? I was trying to be a soul boy then. I had a Pringle, you had to have a Pringle sweater. It was a sort of football casual look. Luckily, you don't see the rest of, I had, sort of Farah slacks and burgundy slip-on loafers. And I tried to, I was trying to grow a soul boy wedge, but I had curly hair. My hair was naturally curly. So it just looked kind of ridiculous. It was more sort of flock of seagulls. Yeah.
I share your pain. I spent a lot of time being chemically straightened for hours on end to try and get that Weller look. And it never worked. It was an absolute car crash. There's a few interviews I'd love to touch on if that's all right. And I know we're a bit short on time, but I hope you can kind of stick with me for a bit.
Sorry, I've been babbling away.
No. This is amazing, honestly. So,
you know what? Actually, it's weird, Dan, because I spend so much of my life talking to other people and thinking, get to the point, and I've just been rambling like a, guilty schoolboy.
Oh, no. Yeah, exactly. I want to talk to you about 2012 Master Tapes because I mentioned about Paul not necessarily wanting to look back, but there's this wonderful A and B side where you're at Maida Vale, you're talking to Paul about, and the A side is The Gift, so that final Jam album, and the B side is The Audience. And this has already come up on the podcast because Daniel Ash, otherwise known as the musician Teenage Waitress, was one of the people who asked the questions, and he's been one of my guests on the podcast. So he has lovely memories of that session, that interview. But,
was he the kid that played?
Yeah.
That was amazing. Yeah, he was in the audience and he's asked a question about writer's block, I think. Do you know what? I don't. Is he in the Master Tapes?
Yeah, yes, he is. I found him. Yeah, he is.
He is there. Okay, yeah, but his song isn't, because I remember Daniel said, so I think his question was, do you ever have writer's block and how do you deal with it? And Paul talked about how you work through it and you've just got to really sort of relax and you just, you've got to trust yourself and the words will come at some point and the muse will return. And then later on, I said, he was playing, Paul was playing, and I said, let's have another song. And he said, no, I want to hear his song. And Daniel was sitting in the audience and he pulled him out and Paul handed him his Gibson J45 guitar and said, go on, play me one of your songs. And Daniel, to his credit, who I think was only 18, you may know better. I remember him being very young. That's probably about right.
Yeah.
Is that right? I think he was about 18, sat there on the stage in front of the Master Tapes audience and played one of his songs. And it was great. And Paul and I sat on the stage, not on our chair. We just sat on the edge of the stage watching him. And I just thought that's a lovely moment. And I just think it says a lot about Paul Weller. It's that thing goes back to those early days of the Style Council and the Jam. The Sobel gigs that I was talking about. When I think back to those, that was like he sort of billed it as like his version of the Stax Review show. So I remember, he turned up and there was a local band supporting the Jam on every leg of a gig. There would always be a local band. And then I remember Bananarama came on. Nobody knew who Bananarama were. And they got sort of booed and bottled off. Then there was a funk band. I can't remember what they were called. Pete Perfides would know. I should ask Pete. They were one of those sort of, funk bands of the early 80s, British funk bands. And then Department S. He was like that, of course, when he set up Respond. And it was about encouraging the next generation. And I thought it was a similar sort of thing, that it was his moment. It was his program. We were focusing on the Jam. And in the spirit, I guess, of reaching back to who he was at that time. And he'd set up his publishing company, Paul, at that time, hadn't he? Riot Stories, encouraging young writers. And I think it was the same sort of thing. No, come on. Let's hear what the kid has to say. Let's hear his song. It was a lovely moment.
Yeah, and I think, and Paul continues to do that, doesn't he? Recommend new artists, work with new artists.
Oh, totally.
Every interview you read, he's kind of talking about something he's been digging and supporting, and then that helps.
I get texts. I get something. Get texts out of the blue saying, "Have you heard this?" Or "Have
you're one of those.
Check this out." No. He needs to kind of, and also I will do the same thing. Whatever it is, something recently that would have really struck me that I thought, oh, he'll like this, and I like that thing. He's so enthusiastic. He just loves music and he loves discovering new sounds, very often that reach back, that possibly have an echo from the past, but he's always wanted to discover something new. because he wants that to feed into his own music.
And we talked earlier about like every album sounding different. And what I've loved in recent years is the access you've had to Paul. There's the True Meanings documentary where you're walking around Ripley talking about it. There's the 3 Songs podcast that you're at Black Barn and you're seeing his old bashed up guitar.
Oh, that was great.
Yeah. So tell me about the time that you spent with Paul in recent years and those experiences.
I'm lucky enough to have spent a bit of time at Black Barn over the years, really from around the time when we were doing Suburban 100. And I went down with Suzanne Dean, the designer, and we heard 22 Dreams, the album, before he had finished it. And it was sort of before it was sort of more or less there in order. And it was just, and I'd heard some demo, he'd played me some demos at home, but I went down to the barn. I think that was probably the first time I'd been down there. I'm sort of almost reluctant to say this because it just sounds like showing off, but I kind of have heard all of the albums that he's made since then as he's finished them, as he's sort of wrapping them up or just finished them and wanting to play them. And, and he does that with a lot of people. He wants a response. And he wants to share it. I've been lucky enough to have been in the studio sometimes when he's recording, which is a really amazing thing to watch as well, because he is so focused, as a musician, as an arranger. You think of him as he's a great lyricist, he's a great singer, but I think it's his arrangements and it's his sense of production as well. He works with Stan and Charles Rees, and there's such a team there at the barn, but I'm always aware when I'm there that Paul is directing operations, and even if it's just a suggestion, but hearing him record, for instance, the vocal, I was there when he was recording the vocal for No Tears to Cry on Wake Up the Nation.
Yeah.
And that was, it was late and I'd gone down there to hear some tracks, because that was coming together, and he works late and we'd gone off for a curry, as often happens down there in Ripley, and then come back, and he wanted to do some more of this vocal. And there's a bridge section, there's a middle 8 section. He was sort of nailing that section and laying a couple of harmonies on. And that was just amazing to see, the sense of, he knew, he could hear it. He could hear the sound that he was trying to create. And it was a real privilege to see him work like that. He's a very, very serious musician.
I remember watching the True Meanings documentary and him talking about Gravity, which is a song that's come up on the podcast quite a lot, along with aspects from that True Meanings album, which
he previewed on Mastertapes, by the way.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And it was a work in progress, wasn't it?
It was a work in progress. Yeah. But you know what? That's really interesting. You think about that's 3 examples of, I was there when, he played You Do Something to Me years ago in the studio. So here's a new song. I'll just try this one. He played Gravity on Radio 4 for Mastertapes before it was sort of more or less finished, but he hadn't recorded it and he was putting it out there. And more recently on the 3 Songs podcast, these 3, you'll remember the conceit of the podcast was a work I made, a work I wish I'd made, and the thing I'm making. And he played Failed off Fat Pop. So that was obviously when he was, when did we do that? So that was it before On Sunset? So he'd obviously I think it was during the On Sunset session. So he'd obviously written it during then, and he played it to me and allowed it to go out. He hadn't finished the structure. He hadn't finished the lyrics, and he's not precious like that. When we did Mastertapes and he was trying to talk about the gift and the way it was recorded, and he played a version of Just Who Is the 5 O'Clock Hero. And he was trying to remember the chords, and he had been working it out in the days before. And we'd been chatting on the phone about which songs he might be able to play, because he hadn't played any of those songs. He hadn't played any of them, apart from Town Called Malice, which I think had just come back into the set around that time, but he hadn't played any of the other songs. And he tried to work out Just Who's the 5 O'Clock Hero, which it turns out has got the most ludicrously complex chord structure. The amount of chords in that song and the amount of lyrics, and he tried to play it and he did it twice and just, the song fell apart twice and the audience were laughing. And in the edit, my producer, Paul Kobrak, came to it and he phoned me up and he just went, "No, what are we going to do about that bit?" And I said, well, you keep it in there. He said, "Well, you can't keep it in. He's getting it all wrong. The audience are laughing." And he's like, I just went, I don't think, and I phoned Paul. I said, "Look, we got this thing, when you're doing, this is Just Who Is the 5 O'Clock Hero. You got it wrong. Do you mind that being in?" And he went, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, getting it wrong. Look," and he went, "Well, that's the whole point, isn't it? It's so complex. It was such a long time ago." So I don't And I just thought, that's fantastic. Yeah. The artistic process, laying it bare, again, not being precious about. There's a lot of artists, who would have a team of advisors who would be, telling which version of the song you can play, and would have veto and all sorts of deals done. That's not to say that Paul doesn't have really quality control standards. His standards are really, really high, but I think he's also aware that the artistic process is something which is really fascinating to a lot of people. And you have to chip away, and it's a struggle. And actually looking back at that song, as he said at the time, those are young man's chords.
But that complexity at such a young age, like you say, as well, is really interesting. But
amazing.
But yeah, you're right, because Gravity, in your podcast, he was talking about in the True Meanings documentary, he was talking about Gravity having been around for a while and him needing to create an album around it in the end. And yeah, you're right. The first time we heard Gravity was on your show, which would have been 5 years before. So yeah, that's a really great connection. It seemed then he was really reflective. Out of any moments I've heard him talking in interviews, it seemed like at that moment when he was 60, he was prepared to look back. He was prepared to reflect. And you hear that through the lyrics, some of which he's not written, others have written with him or for him. But there's a lovely bit in that documentary where he says about as well, in the last few years, he's learned how to sing properly, which I thought was fascinating too.
But again, that's Paul being self-deprecating. He's always had a great voice that suits different styles. I know I go back to Thick as Thieves and Setting Suns and sound effects a lot because it's where I came in. But his voice at that time was astonishing. Technically, strangely, given that, he's a young man at the time, it's not technically as good as the way he can sing now, but it's just got a character and it's got a depth. Always amazed me that he was so young and he had that kind of he seemed old before his years. I could never work. He always seemed, when we were kids, he seemed like a sort of, not just like a big brother, but he just seemed older and wiser. And, he had this sort of depth and authority, but a lot of that was in the voice. But I think technically, yeah, he's probably tuning his voice better. He's using it in a different way. I think he's using it more as an instrument. I think you've really sort of heard that from 22 Dreams onwards, increasingly. And in True Meanings, taking the volume down, not just in the studio with the settings of those songs, which are beautifully arranged. I mean, I do love that album. But seeing him on stage at those Royal Festival Hall gigs, and I was there in the sound check. I mean, it was we actually had, I was at the sound check for those on the first night. There was quite a big debate about the volume because sitting out in the hall, I'd never heard him so quiet. And there was a thing that was sort of like, is it loud enough? And it was partly about the levels because it was so much about the acoustic and controlling the feedback. It's different to plugging in and having that sort of big electric sound. Hearing just the nuance of the acoustic sound, and the orchestra, because Hannah Peel was there with it wasn't a full orchestra, but it was a large ensemble of string musicians and horn players. But it was just about keeping everything and keeping the space. And I remember Paul was really insistent. He was saying, I want everybody to play as quietly as possible. And that's not something you associate with Paul Weller, who in the past, has been, some of the gigs have been the loudest gigs I've heard. Sometimes I think he's been too loud. But I mean, it was really interesting. And it's about control. And it allowed his voice, I think, for him to express himself and express the tone and the timbre of the voice as well. That readiness and that, people always talk about the cello as an instrument is the closest to the human voice. I think there's a sort of cello-like aspect to Paul's voice, and you hear it on a lot of those songs on True Meanings. Wishing Well, I think, is something that is just a great lyric, and White Horses in particular, which I know he wrote with Erland, the lovely Erland Cooper. Have you talked to Erland for this podcast? I
haven't yet because he's too busy burying his latest album, I think.
Yeah, it's buried. It's buried. He's just waiting for somebody to dig it up. But it's interesting. There's so many people over, I love the Jam and I didn't even question. I never really have questioned why, you sort of sometimes leave those teenage obsessions behind. You can see behind me, I've got records behind me. Yeah. And there's many records in there that I probably loved when I was 14, 15, 16, which I haven't played for years and years, Although having said that, I was in the gym the other day and I put the first Undertones record on, only because a friend of mine had been running and had texted to say, my God, I just listened to the first Undertones album whilst running and it was just brilliant. And I'd sort of put it to the test. And, I usually put hip hop on if I'm in the gym. But I put the first Undertones album on. And the amazing thing was I haven't heard that album for, decades. And I remembered every word. It was just like Those things are hardwired. Whereas the Jam, I've not that I play them all the time, but they've never been far away. And over the years, I realized that there are many people like Erland, and talking to Erland recently in an interview I did for him, talking about how he came across Paul, or, other, people from all walks of life. People, I remember, again, this is, slightly name dropping. This was years ago, sitting outside a cafe in Portland Place near the BBC with Paul, when we were just, meeting and having a cup of tea, and Robert Peston walked past, and Robert stopped to say hello, because I know Robert, and he was a BBC political editor at the time. And he suddenly realized who I was talking to, and I introduced him to Paul, and Robert was just totally like a kid. He was like an absolute kid, and Paul, who obviously knew who he was, just went, oh yeah, well, come and see the show, just give us a bell and we'll put you on the list. And, it was just lovely to see. And you realize that actually there's a lot of people who have gone on to do really interesting things, that, whose first love and who still revere, the Jam, and what Paul did, and the voice he offered, and the sort of insight he offered to many people of my generation, with the Jam in particular.
Now, we have to touch on Front Row. There's this amazing Radio 4 program that you've been a part of for as long as I can remember, probably more than you can remember as well. And we'll talk about this kind of startling news that you gave me just before we started recording this podcast. But there was a wonderful chat that you had with Paul, which actually was a small chat, but I imagine was probably a whole day of loveliness, where you took him on a tour of the Jam exhibition with him and Nicky Weller at Somerset House. Can you remember that? Just so, because he hadn't seen it at all. And it was basically opening the doors and you getting his reaction, you chatting about it as he went through. And like I say, he's famously not a nostalgic person, but what did he make of it all? That
was great, wasn't it? Do you know, by total coincidence, I was in Somerset House last night.
Funny.
For an art exhibition in the same gallery, Iranian artist called Shirin Neshat. And but I was that's weird that you mentioned that, because I was there last night and I was thinking about that show, the Jam exhibition that Nicky put together with Den Davis, who had that astonishing built up over many, many years, the collection of not just memorabilia, but I mean instruments and amps and everything. And I just phoned Paul and asked him if he would come down and walk around it for Front Row, be the only thing that he was going to do, the only interview about it. So he had no preconceptions. He didn't know what was in it. I think Nicky had told him, they've got some really great stuff. But I remember we walked in, and the first thing, as many of your listeners will know who saw that show, you walk in and the first thing you saw was the stage set as it was for the final show at Brighton. So, there's Rick's white kit and Paul's, Rickenbacker propped against his stack of Marshall amps. And that bass that I was talking about earlier, that Bruce had started playing. And the first thing Paul did was he walked in, he just went, "What's that?" And I went, "What's what?" And he went, "That's not, what's that bass?" And I just went, "Oh, that was and Nicky was going, "That's Bruce's bass." He was going, "No, it wasn't. He's never played that." And he was obviously totally forgotten. And it was a really interesting thing. And then he just went, "Whose gear is this?" And Nicky was saying, "Well, it was all yours." He was going, "Well, who owns it?" And it was really kind of sort of nonplussed. It was like, what is this? The actual gear? This is actually the stuff we played. It wasn't sort of, they got some Marshall amps that looked a bit like the ones, and they got a Rick, no. And I think, I don't know, you'd have to ask Paul, but he was, I think it was really interesting. He is reluctant, obviously, to look back and, but because there's always so much more to do in the future. There were some lovely moments, like finding the comic strips that he used to write as a kid, and his school reports. That was it, because Nicky, or, his mum, Anne, had obviously kept all of his school reports, and they were on show. And it was really interesting, actually, looking at those. And he took great pride in that they were okay. We often think about, Paul Weller, he left school with, sort of no qualifications and hated it. It was, academic failure. Actually, it's not true. You look at the school reports, they're pretty good grades. And I remember at the time, I mean, you probably remember it better because I haven't heard it since we did it, but he said, look, good grades. Look,
it was
sort of like, B's and C's and an A for English, and it was English and art that were, and then of course there were those doodles, and then it was a great exhibition, but it must have been strange, like falling down a rabbit hole for him.
Yeah. And like you say, when he's thinking like, oh, these are replicas, or this is just, but it's like, no, this is the actual stuff. The
actual stuff. Yeah. No, that was lovely to be able to do that. I mean, I've been very, very lucky that I've built a relationship with him where I can call on him to do things like that, you know, to do the podcasts. And, you know, he's been on front row a lot of times, you know, probably been on front row more time. I mean, to the point actually where I think I had to fess up and I had to sort of say, look, I can't have you on front row anymore because people know we have a sort of relationship and I've got to have a sort of journalistic distance from my guests. And
I think he's been on front row almost as much as he's been on Later with Jules Holland. That's how often.
He probably has. He probably has.
As somebody who loves radio, it's always a pleasure listening to you on the radio. And I worked in the industry for a little while, but realized I was nowhere near as talented as I wanted to be in that space. But you've mastered the art of that program at Front Row, but something new is coming from you. Tell me about this new show that you're going to be doing.
Yeah, I think I finally, like you say, kind of got to, you know, can just about hold a radio program together. But, you know, I've done Front Row for 20 years. By the time this goes out, I probably will have done my last edition. You know, I've done it for a long time and I've loved doing it. But I have something new which I want to explore. By the time we're on air with this, we may already be on air with a new program. And it's an interview show, me talking to a big cultural figure every week on Radio 4, which is going to be a sort of podcast. It's for BBC Sounds, for BBC 4 as well. So we're going to visualize. They will be filmed, and for some of them, still being negotiated. So watch this space. We may be up and running by the time this is out, but it's a really exciting new project in which I will be leading big figures. While we're talking, actually, my phone's been buzzing because there's a very, very big guest who we have got for the first show. And I've been slightly distracted during this conversation because I've seen the emails coming in. I have, because we've been trying to make sure we can get this particular guest.
Are you like this podcast where I've just got a list of all the people I want to talk to? Is it that kind of thing where you've got, there's a list?
Oh, we've got a list, and we've got confirmations of people who will do it, and there's some really, really interesting names. You know,
wow.
Number one, who we are trying to nail at the moment, who may already be on air by the time this goes out, is somebody I've interviewed a few times in the past, who is just way up there at the top of the tree, really.
Wow. Okay. Well, exciting stuff. Exciting stuff. And when does it go out? When is the new show? Yeah.
Saturday, I think we're on at 7:15. So it's the same slot as Front Row. And it's called This Cultural Life, a weekly show and podcast available on all good downloads. Look, my phone's pinging again. It's
Right. You have to go because you're a very busy man. I have two final questions for you before you go. You're allowed one Paul Weller song for the rest of your life. It can be the Jam, the Style Council, or Paul Weller solo. Which one's it going to be?
Oh my God. How do I choose that?
One way I've worked out how to do it is just to go, okay, well, straight after this interview or this conversation, which would be the one that you put on? Given
that we were talking a lot about, setting suns, I'd probably put Thick as Thieves on. And I think that is one that would sustain me. I always think about Desert Island Disc, which one would you take that actually sort of, I think something that just stands the test of time, that just has such elegance and a sense of space and longing, is Wildwood. I just think Wildwood, you can't go wrong. I'm not sure if it's my favorite. They change all the time.
Yeah.
I love On Sunset. I think that's a great album. I think the title track itself, again, I was so lucky to be in the studio with Hannah Peel and Paul when they were recording the strings for that and more.
Wow.
And Rockets in fact, the three songs at the Church Studios in Crouch End. That was a couple of years ago. And I was there in the studio. In fact, there's a little film of the On Sunset, promo film, and you can see I'm sort of there nodding along.
Hannah told me that was like the hottest day ever.
It was so hot. It was an August day. It was so hot. And they recorded. So it was the first time I'd heard On Sunset and Rockets in particular, which was just astonishing. And I think they did more as well. But so I was very lucky to hear that. I love the track On Sunset. I think it's just fantastic. I don't know. Look, it's impossible. It's just impossible. It really is impossible. I think if it was a jam song, I would have to go with Thick as Thieves, probably. If it's, something from the solo album, Wildwood, you can't go wrong. It's just an absolute classic. And Style Council, I don't know, piano version of Ever Changing Moods.
Oh, nice.
Full band version of Ever Changing Moods.
The long one, the short one, the fast one, the slow one. Yeah.
I don't know. I tell you what I love. I love that very stripped down Parisian version of Paris Match, where Paul sings in French. I love the sound on that as well, because it's the sound of freedom and it's the sound of taking chances, and there's something very romantic about it. And, people forget that. I mean, Paul Weller is a absolute romantic at heart. You hear that in so many of the songs. Yeah. So I think, that's something to take away with.
Final question. Purpose of this podcast is not least to meet amazing people like yourself, to talk about this man whose music I love. But it's also, as a radio presenter, I never got to interview Paul Weller. The purpose of this podcast is to make that dream come true. Having given up my radio career 10 years ago, to be able to interview Paul Weller, if it happens, what should I talk to him about? What should I ask him?
Ask him about his next record. Ask him about what he's doing next. I mean, the point is that, as Paul will say, and I agree with this because I think about this in terms of my work, interviews or programs I make, I do think as a freelance, as somebody who, is dependent on a reputation and doing things right, you really are only as good as your last work. And he's aware of that. And I think that's what's driven him on in the last few years, the fact that the quality has been so extraordinarily high. And so what he is doing undoubtedly at the moment is making another record. And what you should do is ask him about how that's going and what's shaping it, what the influences are, who he wants to work with. The key to Paul Weller is looking forward and adopt that strategy, Dan, when you finally, what are you, come on, when's this going to happen?
Well, who knows? There's too many nice people like yourself that I want to talk to first. I don't want to rush it, but then I don't want to miss an opportunity either. So who knows? We'll see.
Yeah. Ask him about what next. That's the thing. What next?
John, this has been, honestly, what an absolute pleasure to spend time in your company talking about the Jam, the Style Council, and Paul Weller. Thank you so much. Good luck with the new show as well. And thanks so much for joining me, man.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me. Absolute pleasure to be here.
Well, there you go. I told you it was going to be good, didn't I? John Wilson, another amazing guest on the podcast. And don't forget to tune in Radio 4 Saturday nights, 7:15, This Cultural Life. He was talking about the text he was getting during that chat. That was about Sir Paul McCartney, who is the next special guest on that show this coming Saturday night. Brilliant. You can find them all on the BBC website and BBC Sounds. Dig in. I'll also put loads of links in the show notes as well for some of the interviews that John's done with Paul over the years, the ones that we talked about. Now, don't forget, if you enjoyed this podcast, make sure you follow. Do leave a review. It does help us to find new listeners to the show. You can get in touch on Twitter @WellerFanPod or on Instagram and Facebook. It's Paul Weller Fan Podcast. And if you dig into the show notes, you can even buy me a coffee as well. Always greatly appreciated. I'll see you next time.